June 4, 1942. High over the Pacific, east of Midway, the sky begins lying to Japanese pilots. Below them, two American Wildcats are flying so close together it almost looks careless. The Grummans are squat, dark, slower than the Zero, heavier on the controls, and in every way they seem like the wrong machine for this kind of war. Japan has the better climber. Japan has the better turner. Japan has the airplane that has already humiliated Allied fighters from China to Malaya to the Philippines. So when the Zeros begin dropping into position, nothing looks unusual. One American fighter seems exposed. Then both of them turn inward, not away, inward. For one strange second it looks like a mistake. The two Wildcats are now cutting across each other's path, nose to nose, as if both pilots have chosen the worst possible moment to panic. A Japanese pilot commits to the tail of the nearer target. He is close enough now. The firing angle is nearly perfect. Then the second Wildcat crosses behind the first and opens fire. The easy kill disappears. The geometry changes. The man who was hunting is suddenly flying through someone else's guns. And a question follows them into the next turn. How do you defeat an enemy that has stopped offering the fight you trained for? No one answers that over Midway. Not yet. By the summer of 1942, Japanese naval aviators have earned their confidence the hard way. They have flown over China. They have struck Pearl Harbor. They have swept Allied air arms aside over the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Their Mitsubishi A6M Zero climbs at more than 5,000 feet per minute in early American estimates. It turns inside almost anything it meets. It arrives over a battlefield with a reputation already doing half the work. Pilots trust it because it has justified trust, again and again. A Zero feels alive in the hands of a skilled aviator. Light on the controls, quick in the climb, sharp in the turn, deadly once it slips behind another fighter. Most opponents who try to answer it with pride instead of caution vanish quickly. Ready rooms across the Pacific have seen that lesson repeated often enough to stop calling it a lesson. By then, it feels like law. At an airfield briefing, a Japanese instructor taps a chalkboard with two fingers. Do not stay high and hesitate. Close. Turn. Finish. No one in the room argues. Why would they? The method has worked from one ocean horizon to the next. Far away in Coronado, California, John S. Thach is already uneasy. He has read the intelligence reports. The Zero can outclimb his fighter. It can outturn it too. In the categories fighter pilots respect most, his F4F Wildcat comes second. He does not sit with that discomfort for long. He carries it home. At his dining table, he starts arranging kitchen matches into little formations. A leader here, wingmen there, enemy behind, angles, distances, crossings, escape lines. He is not searching for a beautiful maneuver. Beauty belongs to airshow thinking. He is trying to keep pilots alive against a machine that has all the elegant advantages. He studies the old three-plane section and dislikes what he sees. Too many eyes committed to the wrong things. Too many ways to die confused. So he begins stripping the problem down. Two-plane sections, cleaner sightlines, clearer responsibility. One pilot threatened, one pilot free to answer. He does not need beauty, he needs a trap. The Wildcat looks like the wrong aircraft for a masterpiece. The F4F3 can make roughly 328 to 333 miles per hour, depending on altitude and condition. Early climb rate sits near 3,000 feet per minute. Service ceiling reaches beyond 33,000 feet, with some later figures pushing toward 37,500. It is driven by a Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp. It carries .50 caliber machine guns in the wings. Some versions mount 4. Later variants bring 6. Armor and self-sealing tanks help keep pilots alive, even while adding weight. None of this sounds graceful. A mechanic running his palm along a Wildcat's fuselage would not call it graceful either. He would call it solid. The airplane has thick skin, stubborn systems, and a habit of bringing damaged men home. It can dive hard. It can absorb hits that would likely cripple a lighter aircraft. It fires dense bursts when the chance appears. In a turning contest, those strengths do not save you. In the right arrangement, they do. The arrangement is simple on paper and difficult in the body. Two American fighters hold deliberate spacing. A Zero gets on the tail of one. The endangered pilot stays steady longer than instinct likes. His partner waits. At the last moment, both turn toward each other and cross. The attacker, fully committed to one target, slides into the second pilot's line of fire. It sounds almost too plain. War often hides its cruelest ideas inside plain language. Timing controls everything. Turn too early and the enemy breaks off. Turn too late and your friend dies. Turn too wide and the opening never forms. Turn too tight and both fighters ruin the spacing. The maneuver is not about courage alone. It is about discipline surviving panic. Thach drills it into his pilots anyway. 2 plane sections inside a 4-plane division. Mutual protection instead of individual flourish. Few signals, fewer heroic impulses. He wants pilots who can wait half a second longer than fear allows and still obey the plan. A tactic built like that does not advertise itself. It waits. The Pacific gives the Americans very little time to wait. December 1941 into early 1942 becomes a season of punishment. In the Philippines, aircraft are destroyed on the ground and in the air. In the Dutch East Indies, losses compound. At Coral Sea, carrier combat reveals how quickly confusion can kill. Everywhere the Zero appears, it seems to confirm the same conclusion. Old instincts are not enough. Yet American courage is not missing. On February 20, 1942, Butch O'Hare flies from USS Lexington and tears into an incoming Japanese bomber formation, downing 5 in one action and becoming the Navy's first ace of the war. One pilot, one desperate defense, one astonishing result. Nobody watching could mistake what he had done. Nobody honest could think one man's brilliance was a war plan. That distinction matters. A heroic exception can save a ship. A repeatable method can save a service. Thach is building the second kind of answer. Across the Pacific, Japanese aviators keep collecting evidence that the first kind is enough. Allied pilots break formation. Allied pilots turn with the Zero. Allied pilots chase and separate. Skilled Japanese flyers punish each mistake. Over time, repeated success becomes more than confidence. It becomes expectation. Expectation is comforting. Expectation also blinds. At Midway, the trap finally leaves the table and enters the sky. June 4, 1942. American torpedo planes need cover. Japanese fighters hold the upper hand in maneuverability. Air above the fleet is layered with speed, glare, nerves, and misjudgment. Thach's pilots climb into it carrying a maneuver many of their enemies have never seen. A Japanese pilot rolls into attack and finds exactly what he wants. A Wildcat below, a stern approach. A few seconds more, and the firing angle will settle. Then the Wildcat turns toward another Wildcat. The second American crosses behind it. Everything that looked simple a breath ago becomes crowded. The point is not that every crossing kills. The point is that the old certainty cracks. A target that seemed isolated keeps becoming connected. A clean tail chase keeps turning into a brief, dangerous tunnel lined with someone else's guns. A Japanese pilot can still win. He can still outfly, outclimb, outturn. But now he must keep asking another question in the middle of the pass. Who else is attached to this target? No cockpit likes extra questions. Not at 250 miles per hour. Not when the sun is wrong and the sea below looks like hammered metal. Not when another burst may already be on the way. Later, in a Japanese debrief, a pilot describes what bothered him most. Not the American guns, not the speed. The target moved, he says first. Then he corrects himself. No, the fight moved. That correction tells the story. For months, Japanese pilots have trusted a sequence that has served them well. Find the tail, tighten the turn, finish. The weave tampers with the sequence itself. It creates a crossing point where the attacker's confidence starts working for the defender. Not magic, something colder. Midway does not settle the whole argument. Nothing in the Pacific does. One battle offers a glimpse, another offers friction, then another offers attrition. The Solomons will decide whether this is merely clever or truly durable. Guadalcanal is where clever things go to be tested until they stop sounding clever. Around Henderson Field, the war loses whatever neatness the maps promised. Pilots launch tired. Mechanics patch aircraft with whatever they can spare. Engines cook in the heat. Missions repeat, until the days blur into scramble, climb, intercept, land, repair, and do it again. Japanese aviators come south from long distances. Americans rise from a battered island whose airstrip itself feels temporary. Air combat here becomes repetitive in the most dangerous way. A Marine pilot climbs into a Wildcat with yesterday's holes skinned over. He is young enough to listen carefully and old enough now to know what matters. In the briefing, nobody tells him to outfly the Zero. Nobody suggests proving anything with a show turn. The section leader says only this: stay paired. On paper, those two words look small. In combat, they become difficult. Clouds shear formations apart. Sun glare hides friend and foe alike. A diving attacker makes every nerve in the body demand an immediate answer. The temptation is always there to yank the aircraft away and solve the problem alone. Many pilots do. The Pacific keeps the ledger. Joe Foss and other Marine pilots learn quickly that survival has a grammar. Altitude matters. Spacing matters. Short, accurate bursts matter. Turning with a Zero for too long is an invitation, not a solution. Men who adapt keep flying. Men who refuse the terms of the new grammar are remembered differently. The Cactus Air Force turns instruction into reflex because there is no other option. One afternoon over the slot, a young pilot nearly breaks too early. A Zero is behind him. He feels it rather than sees it. Every muscle wants to run. Instead, he holds half a heartbeat longer, turns inward, and watches tracers whip past where his tail had been. His wingman opens fire from the crossing angle. The Japanese fighter rolls away, trailing smoke. He does not celebrate over the radio. He only breathes again. Hours later, a mechanic counts holes in that Wildcat with a grease pencil. 3 across the fuselage skin, 1 near a panel line, another under the wing root. He has seen worse. He has also seen aircraft that did not come back at all. The pilot stands nearby with his helmet in hand, staring not at the damage, but at the moment before the turn. The machine gave him time. Barely. A Zero would have felt different in that exchange. Lighter, faster in the climb, more comfortable in the turn. More fragile, too. The Japanese fighter buys its elegance with thinner protection. The Wildcat buys survival with weight. In another kind of war, that difference might feel clumsy. Over the Solomons, it starts looking practical. Japanese pilots notice the practicality before they have a name for it. Wildcats do not always behave like doomed aircraft. They absorb punishment. They dive away harder than expected. They refuse easy circles. They keep forcing the attack to remain unfinished for 1 second too long. Those seconds gather. Seconds become habits. Habits become dread. A veteran Zero pilot returns to base, irritated by something he cannot present as a mechanical complaint. His aircraft performed beautifully. His gunnery was not poor. The Americans were still in heavier fighters. Yet twice in one mission, he had felt his firing run collapse at the crossing point. A younger pilot asks what the Americans are doing. He draws 2 lines on a map case. Every time you think one is alone, he says, look again. Men listening to him hear more than advice. They hear caution entering a voice that used to sound certain. That change does not spread through communiques first. It spreads through posture, through the extra glance before a dive, through an attack begun a fraction later than before, through the suspicion that an obvious target may not be obvious at all. By late 1942, the statistics begin muttering the same truth from another direction. Wildcat pilots will later be credited with a lopsided score against Japanese aircraft, roughly 9-1 by the end of the year, in Navy and Marine claims. By war's end, the F4F family will be associated with 1,006 enemy aircraft destroyed and 58 aces. Numbers never capture every confusion in combat, but they do expose movement. A fighter many had dismissed is no longer merely enduring. It is winning often enough to change the mood of the sky. This does not mean the Zero has ceased to be dangerous. A Wildcat pilot who abandons discipline and tries to mirror the Japanese turn still risks dying very quickly. A section that loses spacing can still be split open. A pilot who chases alone can still vanish. Many do. The maneuver is not invincibility. It is a better response to a bad set of odds. Better responses alter wars, not by removing danger, by making danger costlier for the other side too. Somewhere behind the front edge of the fight, an intelligence officer starts reading pilot reports that sounds slightly different from earlier ones. More references to paired American movement, more mention of abrupt crossing turns, more cases where the first firing run did not end the attack. The reports do not yet add up to a grand doctrine on paper. They feel smaller than that. Fragments, clues, something in the enemy's handling has changed. He underlines the same phrase twice, target not isolated. An armor chief on an American carrier notices a different clue. Pilots returning from combat are speaking less about individual duels and more about position. They want to know whether they drifted too wide, whether they broke too early, whether their wingman had the angle. They still care about kills. They care more now about execution. A fighter force grows dangerous when it starts speaking that way. War often turns not on a grand invention, but on a modest one, meeting the right industrial culture. The weave is teachable. That may be its greatest strength. A tactic requiring genius stays rare. A tactic that can be briefed, drilled, corrected, repeated, and carried from one squadron to the next starts behaving like infrastructure. The United States can build around that. Training commands can pass it on. Replacement pilots can arrive with a usable framework instead of a prayer. Japan still has extraordinary individual aviators. America is beginning to multiply ordinary excellence. Even the Wildcat's hardware helps this multiplication. The F4F4, with its folding wings, allows carriers to pack more fighters aboard. More fighters on deck mean more fighters in the air. More fighters in the air mean better chances to preserve pairings and overlapping support. A design detail that looks logistical becomes tactical once combat begins. A hangar choice starts reaching into the gun camera frame. In another squadron, a replacement pilot arrives with fewer combat hours than the veterans beside him. He is not expected to become Butch O'Hare by Friday. He is expected to hold spacing, trust his section, and fire well when the brief opening comes. The standard is demanding. It is also humane in a strange way. The system is not asking him to become a genius first. It is asking him not to fight alone. This is where the American answer begins to outgrow the maneuver that first made it famous. The weave matters. The philosophy underneath it matters more. Mutual protection, energy over vanity, a refusal to spend a whole aircraft trying to rescue a wounded ego. Pilots start carrying these habits into situations that do not look exactly like the original crossing defense. The specific shape varies. The principle stays. That is when an improvisation becomes culture. Japanese aviators feel culture long before they can diagram it. The Americans now seem less eager to descend into private spiral fights. They break with more intention. They appear in supporting pairs. They dive away with purpose and return with structure. Even when the exact weave is absent, the same irritation remains. The enemy keeps refusing to become singular. One target, one decision, one quick victory. Those were the old comforts. A Japanese replacement pilot listens to veterans argue in a tent after a mission. One insists the Americans are still inferior in a turning fight. Another says, only if they give it to you. Nobody answers him right away. The silence does. Silence is common in American ready rooms too, though for different reasons. A pilot who survived because his wingman held position does not always speak first. He sits with the memory of the pass, the late turn, the tracers, the brief sensation that he had already died and simply had not been informed yet. Somebody eventually asks if the crossing worked. He nods once. Close enough. Close enough is often what survival sounds like. Not grandeur, not certainty. Close enough. As 1943 opens, new American fighters begin arriving in force. The F-6F Hellcat brings speed, climb, toughness, and firepower that answer many of the Wildcat's early disadvantages. The F-4U Corsair adds another level of raw performance once its operating problems are managed. On paper, this seems like the real turning point. It is a turning point, but it arrives to a cockpit culture already changed by the Wildcat months. That makes the new machines more dangerous than their specifications alone suggest. A faster aircraft flown by pilots still trapped in dual thinking is merely a better duelist. A faster aircraft flown by men who have learned mutual protection, restraint, patience, and disciplined attack timing becomes something else. The Americans do not discard the old lesson when better planes arrive. They scale it. For Japan, this is a dark development. The early war advantage in elegance and veteran skill had mattered enormously. Now the enemy is fielding aircraft that do not require such painful compromise just to survive. Worse, those aircraft are being flown by services that already learned, through the Wildcat, not to worship the turn. The workaround remains, even after the need for a workaround begins fading. A Japanese squadron leader studying enemy encounters notices an uncomfortable pattern. The Americans have not become reckless with better aircraft. If anything, they have become calmer. He expected speed to make them careless. He expected confidence to loosen their discipline. Instead, the opposite seems to be happening. The better their machines get, the less they seem interested in proving anything one-on-one. He taps the table once. Why are they still flying as if they owe each other? No one gives him a satisfying answer. Across the ocean, an American instructor already has one. Because they do. He stands before new pilots and says nothing poetic at all. Better engines, higher speed, heavier armament, more forgiving climb. Fine, use them. But if you hand the enemy a private fight, you are donating all that advantage for free. He writes one sentence on the board and leaves it there through the whole session. Do not become alone. The Pacific punishes aircraft. It punishes fuel planning, maintenance, eyesight, formation discipline, and nerve. A nation that can turn hard lessons into standard practice begins collecting hidden dividends. Every American squadron that receives replacements already trained to think in pairs pays a lower tuition in blood. Every Japanese unit forced to educate its young through live combat pays a higher one. Skill remains precious. Scale decides how long precious things survive. A radar operator aboard an American carrier never sees the crossing turn itself. He sees blips and vectors and distances. Yet even from that abstract world, he feels the change in the fighter arm. Intercepts are cleaner. Formations hold together longer. Pilots sound more controlled over the radio. When things go badly, reports remain technical instead of frantic. It is a small clue from a dark compartment deep inside a ship. Small clues build the real story. By now, the image of the invincible Zero is beginning to fray. Not because the airplane was a myth. It was not. It remained deadly in capable hands. But its design had been optimized for a style of combat that depended on initiative, veteran quality, and opponents willing to enter the wrong kind of contest. America slowly withdrew consent from that contest. Later aircraft and larger numbers widened the gap, but the first blow to the old hierarchy came earlier. It came when the Americans stopped admiring the Zero enough to imitate it. This is where ego becomes expensive. A pilot who wants to prove he can outturn the impossible is already buying a ticket the Pacific has sold many times before. The smarter pilots learn to refuse the emotional bait. They use the dive, they use altitude, they use a partner, they use brief firing windows instead of long dances. They stop trying to look superior. They settle for being alive and lethal. One Marine veteran puts it more bluntly when a newcomer asks why everyone is so obsessed with spacing. Because funerals are full of individualists. Nobody laughs. The newcomer remembers the line anyway. Japanese pilots, for their part, are not blind to adaptation. A veteran can still read a fight. He can still sense where discipline is weak and where an American formation has begun to fray. He remains dangerous. But each veteran lost now removes not just a skilled flyer, but a body of experience. Japan's training pipeline cannot replace those men at the same rate or with the same seasoning. The Pacific keeps collecting them, one battle at a time, one cockpit at a time. A Japanese instructor faces a class of newer pilots and tries to compress months of lived danger into a few sharp warnings. Do not underestimate the heavy American fighter. Do not chase too long through a crossing turn. Do not assume a target below is unsupported. Do not trust the first easy picture. He hears himself saying these things and knows what they imply. The enemy has become a thinking enemy. In American squadron spaces, men no longer speak of the Wildcat with embarrassment. They speak of it with a sort of hard gratitude. It was never the prettiest machine in the fight. It did not need to be. It carried them through the months when the wrong move still looked attractive. It gave them enough toughness to survive mistakes. It forced them to become professionals before better aircraft made professionalism easier. Some airplanes win admiration. A few win trust. The air war keeps widening. Carrier decks heave in rough water. Deck crews shove fighters into launch position. Armorers belt ammunition. Intelligence officers mark charts. Mechanics work under cowlings slick with heat and oil. Pilots climb in and carry all of that labor into a few compressed minutes above open sea. From the cockpit, combat feels personal. From the deck, it has always been collective. That may be why the Weave fit the American way of war so naturally. It turned what the deck crews already understood into an aerial habit. Nothing on a carrier works alone. Not the launch, not the maintenance, not the recovery, not the radar picture. Why should the fighter pilot imagine he is exempt from the same rule once he leaves the deck? A romantic answer dies there. A practical answer rises in its place. By the middle phase of the Pacific Air War, Japanese pilots are no longer just meeting stubborn wildcats. They are meeting formations shaped by a lesson learned in wildcats and carried forward into better machines. The specific silhouette in the sky changes. The old problem does not. How do you isolate an American who keeps flying inside a network of obligation? More and more often, the answer is, you do not. A veteran Japanese aviator rolls over into attack and delays for the briefest instant. He has seen the crossing trap before. He does not want it again. That hesitation costs him surprise. He knows it immediately. He goes anyway, fires too early, and watches the American break clean. No victory. No damage. Only frustration. Back at base, he says the Americans are making him late. That is as close as he comes to explaining the ghosts. Late. 1 second late, inside the approach. 1 second late, inside the trigger press. 1 second late, inside the fight's shifting shape. That is what the tactic steals. Time. And once time slips, the rest of the advantages arrive damaged. Superior turn. Reduced. Better climb. Delayed. Combat experience. Forced to answer a new pattern instead of an old one. This is why the Weave unsettles pilots more deeply than its simplicity suggests. It does not overpower them, it dislocates them. American gunnery gives the dislocation teeth. Thach had trusted this from the beginning. Heavy machine guns and accurate bursts could matter if pilots gained even a fleeting opening. The crossing turn manufactures that opening. It may last only a second. Against a lightly protected fighter, a second can be enough. A Japanese pilot who survives one such pass carries the memory into the next mission. Fear spreads quickly when it feels mathematical. No pilot enjoys becoming part of another man's geometry. Especially a pilot used to deciding the shape of combat for himself. One evening, a carrier captain listens as recovered pilots describe a day's fighting. No one speaks in grand language. They talk about altitude bands, sun position, dive timing, spacing, turn points. Yet while he listens, a larger truth takes form. These men are not describing separate acts of courage. They are describing coordinated behavior. Their success is beginning to sound less like a collection of talents and more like a system settling into place. He never says that out loud. He does not need to. The Japanese side is hearing a mirrored truth. What once looked like heavy, unsophisticated American fighters now behaves like a problem with layers. Even when the aircraft itself remains less graceful, the encounter does not. Every pass seems attached to some unseen preparation. The opponent has become more disciplined without becoming predictable. That is a deeply annoying combination for an expert flyer. You can exploit carelessness. Calm is harder. This is why the story cannot be reduced to one airplane beating another airplane. The Wildcat never became more elegant than the Zero. The Zero never stopped being formidable. The real shift happened elsewhere. One side kept measuring victory through individual aerial superiority. The other increasingly organized victory through cooperation, training, survivability, and repeated execution under pressure. One aircraft represented finesse. The other became the platform from which a different idea of combat matured. Years later, the visual memory remains easy to picture. Two fighters crossing. A stern attacker suddenly exposed. A burst from the partner. The shape is simple enough for anyone to understand. The deeper meaning took longer to surface. It appears in fragments. A mechanic counting holes. A marine repeating, "Stay paired." A radar operator hearing calmer radio traffic. An intelligence officer underlining, "Target not isolated." A Japanese veteran drawing two lines on a map case. Each fragment by itself looks small. Together, they form the turn in the war. Because the turn in the war often arrives before the scoreboard fully reflects it. It arrives the first time a superior pilot realizes his favorite attack no longer guarantees control. It arrives the first time a replacement pilot survives because a structure stronger than his instincts held him in place. It arrives the first time a fighter service stops demanding virtuosos and starts producing dependable pairs. Those moments rarely make headlines. They make outcomes. By the time Hellcats and Corsairs dominate larger stretches of the Pacific, the earlier lesson has already done its work. Better aircraft now carry men who have been taught not to squander performance on vanity. The enemy faces not only more speed and firepower, but a maturing culture of tactical restraint. Japanese veterans feel the difference even when they cannot always name it. You once fought Americans. Now you fight Americans attached to something. Something larger than the airplane. Larger than the pilot, larger than the moment. That is why the tactic lingers in memory. Not as a clever trick, though it was clever. Not as a miracle, because it was never won. It lingers because it marks the point where the United States Navy stopped trying to answer the Zero with imitation and answered it instead with reorganization. A new fighter idea began there. Harder, less romantic, more scalable. War tends to prefer those qualities in the long run. A Japanese officer once accustomed to teaching certainty now teaches caution. An American pilot once tempted by the private duel now trusts the crossing point. A deck crewman, once sending up fighters in anxiety, now watches them return with a colder professionalism. No single scene declares the balance changed. The change keeps arriving anyway. And still the image from Midway remains the cleanest doorway into the whole transformation. 2 Wildcats below, a Zero above, one pass beginning as expected, ending somewhere else. If the first months of the Pacific War belonged to the fighter that could turn tighter, the next phase belonged to the side that learned faster from being second best. America's answer did not begin with a prettier machine. It began with a pilot at a table, moving kitchen matches until a bad set of odds started looking manageable. Then, other men trusted the idea while bullets came through the canopy. Most revolutions in war sound more dramatic than that. This one did not need to. It only needed to work often enough to bend behavior. To make a Japanese ace glance twice before committing. To make an American novice hold his nerve half a second longer. To make separate cockpits start thinking in pairs. To make the enemy arrive late inside his own confidence. So what were Japan's best pilots really chasing? Not invisible fighters. Not magic, not a myth invented after the fact. They were chasing a version of the battle that no longer existed by the time they reached it, a target that had already crossed, a firing solution that had already aged, a private duel already reclaimed by a second man. They were chasing lost time, and lost time in air combat feels almost supernatural. You know what you saw, you know the angle was there, you know the machine beneath you remains superb. Then the sky rearranges itself around somebody else's plan. That is the real legacy of the Thach Weave. 2 fighters, yes. Crossing lines, yes. But more than that, a hard American discovery that outlived the Wildcat itself. Never let a superior turn decide the whole fight. Never hand the enemy a solitary target if discipline can deny him one. Build enough trust between pilots that fear has to pass through structure before it reaches the controls. The Zero survived many battles. Its clean advantage did not. So the strange thing Japanese pilots saw over Midway was not just a pair of Wildcats turning inward. It was the first visible sign that the sky had started favoring a different kind of mind. Less elegant, less theatrical, less interested in proving who the finer flyer was, more interested in arriving together, firing at the right instant, and leaving the enemy with a question he could not solve fast enough. The sky had begun lying to them because the old picture remained visible for a moment after it had already changed. One American looked alone. He was not. One attack looked finished. It was not. One fighter looked clumsy. It was not the important thing in the frame. And by the time Japan understood how much had changed, the answer had already spread beyond one battle, beyond one squadron, beyond one aircraft. The crossing turn remained in memory because it was easy to see. The deeper shift was harder to spot and far more dangerous. America had learned how to turn connection into a weapon. The ghosts were never in the sky. They were in the gap between what Japanese pilots expected to kill and what the Americans had already learned to become.